to use that reaction button. And just so things go, maybe, because I don't get to have very much time with you, I'm afraid, but I'm looking forward very much to our conversation. What I'd like to do, if it's okay, is to just go through the material, just so that, if you've got a question, maybe something will, 5 minutes later, we'll answer it. Then we'll do questions at the end. I'm going to try and save 15, 20 minutes at the end for questions. Okay, so if that's okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you all can see now the screen that says inequality is no sufficient statistic. That's what we're going to be talking about. And by this, of course, I mean, in a technical sense, you're all economics scholars. In a technical sense, you know that a sufficient statistic is something where if you know its value, you can tell everything else about the system. In statistics, what we try and do is reduce the problem to the minimal set of sufficient statistics. And then from there, we know everything that the data have to tell us. So what I'm going to argue here is that despite what seems to be a common understanding, actually, inequality is no sufficient statistic. But sufficient statistic for what? What are we trying to explain? So let's plow into that. Okay, here is my number one thing I'm trying to explain. There are other things that will make for a coherent story. But the number one thing I'm trying to explain or understand is this graph. This is a time series graph, not by me, but by some scholars who've documented what's happening to global unrest. What's going on with why the world is so unhappy. Now, we all know about echo chambers in social media, Facebook, Twitter, all magnify all this. And we all have an impression that the world is not in a happy place. I mean, the statistics are, abstracting from COVID-19, prosperity is actually at an all-time high. Peace is actually at an all-time high, even conditional on US-China tensions. Everything in the world seems to be good. However, the world is very unhappy. And the world is unhappy and it's spilling over into action on the street. So this is a graph, a time series graph, that the upper line shows strikes and demonstrations, protests worldwide. It's an indicator of global unrest. As you can see, the world came along, and then in 2010, spiked. Something dramatic happened. The world made clear that all the rest of us world, every country knew that every other country was unhappy. And this isn't just happening with all kinds of action, because the bottom part shows armed conflict, the dangerous things in the world with actual weapons from military, and that's flat. I mean, in specific parts of the world, there are some blips, but across the whole world is flat. So something is going on in the world. Global unrest. This is what I'm trying to understand. But I'm not the only one, obviously, because everybody at the World Bank, who just had their annual conference on global unrest, scholars in political economy and economics worldwide, trying to understand this. So included in this, therefore, our greatest fears and concern, something is going on in the world that as scholars, we don't completely understand, but we want to do that. And many people, I'm going to show you what I mean by many people in a minute, but many people point to inequality. They say, oh, there's a simple story. Inequality has risen everywhere in the world. People are angry because inequality has reduced their well-being. They're taking to the streets. People say the yellow jackets in France, of course, their wages fell. They took to the streets. In America, unemployed steelworkers, because of competition with China, unhappy, they voted in Trump, they occupied Capitol Hill. That's what's going on. It's inequality. Well, exactly the point of this lecture is that it's not. We might think inequality is the sufficient statistic for explaining global unrest, but I'm going to argue that it's not. And given the time that I've only got like 40 minutes or so before we go into questions. I can't unpack everything that I've had to try and compress together into the story about why inequality is no sufficient statistic. We're going to point out the leading one. So this talk is going to cover three things. First, what I've already told you about, our greatest fears and concerns. Second, I want to focus on particular aspect of inequality, which is what I'm going to label the resource inadequacy challenge. I'm going to contrast that with the disparity challenge. And then I'm going to do empirical evidence. What does the empirical evidence say on whether inequality is a sufficient statistic? Now, I've said already, I've begun talking about our greatest fears and concerns. But hang on a second. I'm not so egotistical as to say that I put up one chart of a time series and then that is indeed our greatest fears. I'm far from the only one to do this. This was the chart we were looking at. This is Thomas Piketty's chart of American inequality. Thomas Piketty, over a decade ago now, pointed out how in the run-up to 2010, American inequality rose to levels that it had not seen since before, for at least for like 100 years. This is the share of the US income that goes to the top 1%. And Thomas Piketty and his co-workers have documented this rise of the top 1% in all countries. So here's a good candidate. It's the top 1% that is making everybody so angry. And the hypothesis then is that inequality makes the poor and disadvantaged worse off. It immiserizes them. And inequality, through something that we might think of as a Great Gatsby kind of narrative, obstructs social mobility. Stephen Doloff and other people have written about this. Immiserizing the disadvantaged, obstructing social mobility frustrates people. It frustrates people's expectations of a better life. People feel that they have nothing to lose anymore. In the old days, you felt that even if you were poor, if you followed the rules, did the right thing, went to school, worked hard, you could rise in the income distribution. Here, under this hypothesis, you cannot, because inequality of the rising kind that we've seen from Piketty and other people document makes the disadvantaged worse off, it obstructs social mobility. So to cut to the chase, inequality produces social discord. It reduces social cohesion. And in doing that, it produces political upheaval. And that is the reason for the global unrest. That's the hypothesis. I want to reject this hypothesis. I want to show that this actually is not correct. In that hypothesis, the stories that get told are stories of this kind. This is now a grand narrative. Inequality is driven by globalization and technological change. Society has been polarized into a small elite with highly paid, secure jobs, and everybody else is being squeezed. And it is this inequality that's resulted in, notably, an erosion of our trust in democratic institutions. This is a huge problem. If indeed inequality is the culprit, if indeed inequality is the sufficient statistic. And just to be clear, this is not a new idea that inequality is to blame for all this. I give you three representative thinkers. The bottom here, Barack Obama in 2013, called rising inequality the greatest obstacle and the defining challenge of our time. Pope Francis, leader of the Catholic world, a year after that, tweeted, inequality is the root of social evil. And if you don't believe those two, go all the way back to Confucius, who said, what is really disturbing is not scarcity, but inequality. Inequality is the culprit. Inequality is the sufficient statistic. That's terrible. The popular press has picked this up. Popular press runs stories like this. We have to combat inequality, understand it, tackle inequality, because it's a political choice. And there are vivid pictures that show the outcome from inequality. India is bottom of the Oxfam ranking, and then there's a vivid picture of Indian slums, Indians, sort of picking up rubbish. US does not escape. US income inequality is at the highest level in 50 years. Thomas Piketty and many others document this. So in Singapore itself, where I live, COVID, as has happened in all your societies, I'm sure, inequality and COVID have sort of been ganged together. So this is a picture that's run recently in the local newspaper in Singapore that shows on the one side, a poor family trying to cope with distance learning, study from home during COVID-19. On the other side, a rich family that's got the best equipment, parents have time to spend with their children. Inequality is worsening under COVID. Greatest fears and concern. Okay. Now, my point is very simple. There are other things to explore here, but in the point I want to make in this talk, I want to distinguish resource inadequacy from disparity. Okay. Resource inadequacy is when poor people don't have enough resources to control their own destiny. The poor people that we saw in that Singapore picture that was up 5 seconds ago, the poor people did not have nice computers, did not even have furniture for their children to study from home. They are suffering from resource inadequacy. That is different from the problem of disparity, which is how much I have relative to how much the richest people have. Disparity is about the distance between me and the rich people. Resource inadequacy is how I, being a poor person, cannot control my own destiny. These are two different things. So this is the aspect I want to figure out. Part of the grand narrative is that, well, it's clear what's going on here, because with inequality, the rich are getting more, therefore the poor are getting less, and if the poor are getting less, they must be suffering from resource inadequacy. I want to check this out. What is the empirical evidence? Checking it out, let me just make sure that what I've just said is something that you and I see reflected around us all the time. On the left side of the slide that you see here is discussion about how many people have little prospect for the future. They are looking on at others pulling ahead. This is a quotation from the Human Development Report of 2019 that talks about disparity. Well, it kind of does, but it also talks about resource inadequacy. Now, hang on a second. What this quote does is it confuses the two. It says some people don't have enough resources, but at the same time, they're looking at others who do. This quote is making the problem seem like a zero-sum game. The reason that I have inadequate resources is that I look across the street and I see the rich people pulling ahead. So my question is simply one of logic. If I reduce inequality, will I help people who don't have adequate resources? Okay, this quote does not help me think about this because this quote conflates the two things. But are the two separate? If I reduce inequality, will it actually help the poor? Now, here is something that you and I, as empirical social scientists, can actually say something about. So remember this picture, one side, inadequate resources, the other side, richer people, disparity, but also resource inadequacy. Let me show you vividly what I mean by the difference. Focus on the left side of this picture, the poor family. This is them. They don't have the computer equipment to do study from home. They don't even have desks. The whole family is crowded in. This is a family suffering from resource inadequacy. They're in a terrible situation. But notice they would be in the same terrible situation whether or not there were rich people across the street. The problem of resource inadequacy needs to be logically distinct from the problem of disparity. So let me show you empirical evidence now. And this will then conclude my talk, my lecture, then we'll get to have questions, okay? But the empirical evidence, I'm an empiricist in my research. So I'm afraid that I will have a tendency to maybe exaggerate a little bit the empirical evidence. I won't go overboard. I'll still end in plenty of time, but I do need to convince you of my point, which is once you separate resource inadequacy from disparity, and you think about these two things in a logical way, inequality is not a sufficient statistic. Inequality is a sufficient statistic if you think the world is a zero-sum game. I'm going to show you that the world is not. So this is a hypothetical picture that I'm going to explode into real data. On the bottom of this picture, the horizontal axis is the evolution in time. On the vertical axis is a measure of per capita income of, in these pictures, the bottom 50% of the population in my society, in your society, in the world, however you want to think about your economy. So this is a picture of what's happening to the weak and disadvantaged in society. It's the average income of the bottom 50%. Now, the leftmost panel shows one possibility. In that leftmost panel, the income of the bottom 50% is rising. Right? So that's the situation where the resource inadequacy problem is slowly going away. On the right side of this picture, it shows the opposite. The bottom 50% sees their income falling. So the resource inadequacy challenge is getting worse and worse for the people on the right side of this picture. This is the resource inadequacy issue. What's happening to disparity? The answer is we don't know. We have been able to speak about what's happening to the bottom 50% without ever having to bring in what's happening to the rich. The rich, the top 10%, could be on the left panel, rising, also on the right panel. And at the end of this picture, at the latest time, the level of inequality, the distance between the bottom 50% and the top 10% is actually exactly the same. There's exactly the same level of inequality. But in one picture, the poor are doing well. And in the other picture, the poor are doing terrible. Okay, what is the real world like? Let me show you what the real world is like. Let me begin with Singapore, because this is distant from everybody else. We don't have any political prejudices about it. We're just going to look at the facts. Because if I show up a country here, which you know because it is your country, your mind might start thinking about what's the political conversation happening, who is manipulating what. This is a country that only I am in. None of you lives here, at least I don't think, not from my looking at the spreadsheet. Okay, so this is actually what happened in reality. I want to compare it to the hypothetical situation that I just described. So on the leftmost panel of this picture, the blue line is close to the average income of the top 10%. It's not exactly, but I'll explain what it is in a minute. The bottom line on the right side of this picture is the average income of the bottom 50%. So it's exactly what we were looking at earlier. The blue line is actually not the average income of the top 10%, but it's the distance in income between the bottom 50% and the top 10%. In other words, it's a measure of inequality, because that's what we want to try and get at. But as long as the bottom 50% have very, very low income, it's also basically the average income of the top 10%. So what does the Singapore story say? The Singapore story says between 1980 and 2020, over the last 4 decades, the bottom 50% was flat when you look at the left panel, but inequality rose dramatically. So if this were your country, you would say, okay, this is why people in my country are so unhappy, because the poor are immiserized, the rich are making off with a lot of the improvement in wealth, inequality is high and rising. But notice that actually, the reason that the red line on the left side of this picture looks like it's flat is because it's dwarfed by the inequality number. If I focus on it and I blow it up just by itself, which is the right panel, then we see actually income of the bottom 50% have actually risen. It has actually risen 5-fold in the last 40 years. The poor are actually better off in this time in Singapore. It's just that the rich have become much, much, much better off. But that's different from saying that the poor are immiserized, because the poor are actually well off. I'll show you some examples of immiserized poor in a minute. This is Singapore. Singapore, high and rising inequality, but with an uplift in the bottom 50% as well. Now let's get to some other economies that we know, and then I won't test your patience. I'll then just go to what the whole world looks like. This is the same story for the United States. So for the United States, the blue line on the left panel again shows inequality. The bottom flat line shows the income of the bottom 50%. And what we see is something similar to Singapore. There's been high and rising inequality with what seems to be a stagnant bottom 50%. But now, just as I did with Singapore, I want to zero in on the bottom 50% in America, blow it up. That's the right panel. What does the right panel show? The right panel shows actually the bottom 50% in America are stagnant. Their incomes have barely changed. And in fact, over 2000 to 2010, the incomes of the bottom 50% actually fell in real terms, not relative to the rich, but actually fell. The poor in America became poorer. The poor in America were immiserized. The poor in America do have a reason to be angry from inequality. Okay, so what we've got now, two economies, quite different stories. But if we don't look at the data right, we come away with the wrong idea that inequality is to blame for the unrest in all societies. Let me show you a third example, and then I'll just close up with some aggregate statistics. This is China. China is the great success story in poverty reduction. Over the last 4 decades, 650 million people have been lifted from poverty in China, an increase in the middle class in China at rates faster than ever, anywhere. Poverty reduction in China has been more spectacular, more dramatic than any time in all of human history. But what we see in this picture is that it comes with actually quite a number of subtleties. I won't belabor the point now. Left picture, inequality at bottom 50%, right picture, bottom 50%. And what we see is that in China, in the early part of the sample, between 1980 until 2000, when China entered the WTO, inequality actually fell. This is not something we had seen in any of the other graphs. But then inequality started to rise after China started its own globalization, entered the WTO. But notice something else. On the right side of this picture, at the same time that inequality was falling in China in the early part of the sample, so was income of the poor. Inequality in China fell at the same time that the poor became worse off. So if you're thinking, oh, what we should do is go out there and reduce inequality, well, be careful, because you could find yourself in a situation like 1980s China, where your poor are then actually becoming worse off. A fall in inequality is no guarantee of any kind of success. Let's not further obsess about inequality. So let me now finish. I won't go through these statistics. I won't go through that. Let me come to the punchline of those 3 charts, those 3 case studies that I went through. Because those were 3 countries, one that I happened, well, all of them, I think, we happen to know quite well, US and China. What I've just said there for the US and China might be, changing some of our opinions around the edges, but the main story are things we know. In America, the poor got immiserized. In China, the poor were lifted, but the innovation here is that didn't happen uniformly. It happened only after inequality started to rise. When inequality was falling in China, the poor were getting poorer. The lift of the 650 million out of poverty did not come uniformly. It came only when inequality started to rise. Okay. So that's the conclusion from those 3 case studies. What happens across the world? This chart shows what happens across the world. So let me take you through what's going on here. The bottom, the horizontal axis, is the number of times the average income in the bottom 50% increased over the last 2 decades. So this is the multiple. So you begin at the average income of more than 50% in 2000. How much did it rise by? The more you rise by, the better off your poor people are. So there are some nations where if you look 4 on the horizontal axis, means that that nation had this very poor increase in incomes fourfold in the last 20 years. And there's one country that did that, China. But of course, China's inequality also increased. As you look across this picture, each dot here is a country. And then the blue line is a nonlinear least squares weighted regression line. That's just a nonlinear regression to try and find the best fitting line across all the nations. That line is positively sloped. The vertical axis is the number of times inequality increased over the same time period. So as you go higher up in this picture, when you look at a number like 6, that means that 20 years ago, whatever the inequality was in that country, by 2019, it had increased 6 times. So you don't want to be high up there in that picture in the vertical axis, but you want to be to the right in this picture. The best fitting line is a positively sloped line. Let's pause and think about what that means. There are some countries above, there are some countries below, but actually, for a large part of this cross-country sample, there's quite a good fit of this positively sloped line. Pause and think about what it says. This says that in those countries where you see a good uplift of the poor, chances are you'll also see an increase in inequality. High increases, large increases in inequality come on average with improvements in the conditions of the poor. If you're focused on what's happening on conditions of the poor, it seems to me that this picture is kind of saying, let's go look at the high rising inequality countries. Because that's where, on average, the poor are being uplifted most. Now I see Matthias' hand up. Matthias, is this a clarifying question or is this a discussion question? If it's a discussion question.
More a discussion question, we can have it at the end. No worries.
Is that okay with you? Thank you, I've registered. And Maria, is this a clarifying question or a discussion question?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, it's a clarifying question.
Okay,
I wanted to know what do you mean by poor people? Like what is a poverty line that you're using?
Yeah, so for me, here, the poor people are the people in the bottom 50% of your income distribution. So that means that, in a sense, the poor you will always have with you because it's the bottom 50%. But that also means that having an increase in their well-being is a moving target that gets harder and harder to achieve. When you see an improvement in their well-being, that's actually something you want to give a good thumbs up to because it's not a fixed poverty line. It's the weak and vulnerable in your society. Okay, that's what I mean here. Maria, the other Maria, that you've got your hand up. Is this a clarifying question?
Yes, it is. I would like to ask if, when you say that inequality rise, it's because parallel to the bottom 50 rising, the top income also rise.
That's correct. That's correct. Because remember the examples that we saw of Singapore, the US, and China. For the China example, when the bottom 50% went down, inequality could have risen or could have fallen. It turned out that inequality fell. Inequality, I'm very simple-minded. I don't think about inequality as a Gini coefficient or some, very complicated statistic. For me, inequality is just how far is the bottom 50% from the top 10% in income space. That's all that I mean by inequality. Thank you. Let's see, Kavitya, I hope I'm saying your name right. Is it clarifying?
No, silent maybe.
All right, if it's okay, I've registered Matthias and Kavitya. You will get first shot at the discussion. So please hold on to this. I'm finishing very soon. So this graph shows a positive slope. Now, there are 3 interpretations on this. First is, oh gosh, he's telling me again, the trickle-down story, right? Is this just a trickle-down story? That when the rich get really, really rich, then parts of their high income trickle down to the poor and therefore lift the poor. It could be. I have no evidence against that. It's consistent with the trickle-down story. It's also consistent with a second story, which is an incoming tide lifts all boats. As countries have undergone the last 2 decades of globalization, technological change, whatever, and all of their incomes rise, the incoming tide lifts all boats. So there are 2 different stories. There's a third story, and this is my preferred story. The third story is that this is a supply curve. That if you want the way that economies out there are structured, if you want to buy poverty alleviation, if you want to lift the poor, you're going to have to pay a price in inequality. This is a supply curve. This is a supply curve that we need to work against. Now, which of these stories is right, there's no way to tell from just these data. So let me finish up by taking us through a number of other things, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion questions. But I've also labeled here some interesting examples. What I think are interesting examples. China, way to the right of this picture. Good poverty reduction, high and rising inequality. In fact, above the average. If we now think about the regression line as average performance, China paid too high a price for its poverty reduction. It paid too high a price in inequality. What we want to see are countries like Estonia, EE, will also reduce poverty, will also help lift the poor, but they did that at a price below average in terms of inequality. Countries above have paid too high a price in inequality. Countries below are doing well at keeping inequality in check, even though they're lifting the poor, but there's a price that they have to pay. It's like Game of Thrones. There's an iron price that you have to pay. This is an iron price that you have to pay for reducing poverty, lifting the weak and poor. Is it something else? Well, let me finish, because what happened to inequality is a sufficient statistic. Well, let me conclude by saying inequality has nothing to say about either about further rises in inequality or lifting the poor. This is a graph that shows on the horizontal axis the level of inequality that I calculated as the median level of inequality over this 20-year sample. The vertical axis shows the lifting of the poor. You want to be high up the vertical axis. This line is basically horizontal. Regardless of the level of inequality, people, nations do the poverty reduction that they do in a way that inequality says very little about. Second line that's horizontal is this one. Again, the horizontal axis is the level of inequality. The vertical axis is the change in inequality, the multiples of inequality. Some nations have had to pay a high price in terms of increases in inequality. Other nations, a low price. This line is basically horizontal. The level of inequality says nothing about whether you continue to see further rises in inequality or further reductions. Inequality is not a sufficient statistic. It doesn't tell us anything about anything. So finally, just the last table. This simply confirms the visual impressions that we've got. The strongest correlation that you see is in the first row here between income mobility, which is what I'm calling what happens to the incomes of the very poor. They rise. If they rise, you've got good income mobility. In income inequality, inequality rise and income mobility are strongly positively correlated, rejected at the minuscule levels of significance. The level of inequality says basically nothing. It has a zero correlation about what's happening in societies. And if you don't like just those correlations, the very bottom of this says there were 99 economies where inequality rose. The bottom 50 increased incomes in 95 of them. Got a 96% success rate in increasing the incomes of the poor if you were in a society where inequality rose. the 108 economies where the bottom 50 increased, inequality also rose in 88% of them. So finishing, remember these pictures? The first step to combat inequality is understand it, fail. Understanding inequality actually has very little to do with improving the well-being of society. Remember this picture about how inequality is so important around the world? Fail. Inequality has nothing to do with what's going on around the world. Remember this picture about COVID-19 and the different effects across rich and poor families? Well, also fail. So I'm concluding now. Resource inadequacy versus disparity. Yes, starvation, child hunger, intergenerational crime. Those are problems. Those are problems of poverty. Those are problems of immobility. They're not problems of inequality. What matters for them are individual characteristics, not social traits like inequality. What makes for enable meaningful and satisfying lives is when you give poor people control over their own destiny. So I conclude. I conclude by simply telling you again the facts that I uncovered. The very bottom, in societies where inequality rose, the bottom 50 also got richer. In societies where the bottom 50 increased, 90% of them were societies where inequality also rose. I've covered three things in this lecture. I've told you about a misleading great fear and concerns. I've separated the issues of resource inadequacy and disparity, and I've told you about empirical evidence. So that concludes my talk. I hope now we can have a good set of discussions. So I'll give other people a minute. I see 4 hands up already, but if you want to ask a question, please just put up your hand, click the icon, and then you'll be in queue, and then we'll go through them. We'll go through you one by one. So Matthias, thank you for your patience. Please unmute yourself, and I look forward to your intervention.
Thank you, Professor. It was a really interesting talk. I got convinced, and I agree that inequality is not sufficient. Perhaps I'm not entirely convinced that it has nothing to do. And I'm coming back to like the first question, that is the link between inequality and this sense of there is a lack of social cohesion. And I got thinking, I don't know, perhaps we're missing like an interaction term that in globalization has something to do in this, that it's in the end, social cohesion is much more a perception thing. And I think that even though, as you said, like the average income of the poor has risen, and I mean, poor people is better than 50 years before, I think perhaps nowadays we still have the perception that, I mean, we are more exposed, we are more aware. I mean, I think for all of us today, like, I don't know, we have Instagram, social media, and it's like we're all the time exposed to people with more money or doing, I don't know, you open the cell phone and you see people in the Caribbean enjoying their life, and you're like, huh, I'm doing the right thing now. And I'm pretty sure that, I don't know, even the poor.
No. Yours is a very, thank you, Matthias. That's a wonderful, wonderful intervention. Yours is a very, very important point. It's a point that I take very seriously. And I've tried to think harder. I've tried to think hard and try to engage in discussions about this. Because social cohesion is a key phrase now in economics discussions as well as in policy making and in political economy. And social cohesion is not something that pops up naturally in our models. When you do an error-deferred general equilibrium model with constraints and resources, there's no social cohesion that appears there. But it's something very real. So we've got to think about this. So here are some preliminary thoughts that I hope that you and others who are interested will go on to explore, because yours is a generation that's going to take this discussion forward. One way to think about social cohesion is that it's like envy. It's a perception thing. Like you say, we pick up Instagram and we see what the latest movie stars and the rich people are doing in ways that we didn't before. And as we've learned from culture, you can only envy and covet that you can see. If you don't see it, you don't know that you want to covet it. You're not envious of it. So this is something hugely important. is something that actually takes us outside of our economic measurement. Because how do we calibrate these notions of envy? So I hope that we can think about how we do that. It might come from one of the things that I'm taking this work forward is in doing text mining, is that I'm looking at the kinds of social media feeds that people look at. I'm looking at newspaper reports. So like all the newspaper reports that I showed you, they keep banging home the idea. Inequality is the problem. Inequality is the problem. Even if I didn't think inequality is a problem, after reading all those accounts, I would think inequality was the problem. I've got all these smart journalists telling me that it is. It doesn't even have to be echo chamber in social media. Responsible journalists are doing this. So one of the things I'm doing is doing text data mining to try and correlate the emergence of global unrest in different geographies with what the media in different parts of the world are talking about. Okay, that's a way to try and capture this. It's not going to be perfect. We're never going to have the kind of wonderful income distribution numbers that we do, but that's a way to try and get at this. And I hope others among you who are interested will explore this as well. The more work in this area, the better. But the second thing I might say, Matthias, is that we also have to think, what is the advice I'm going to give to policymakers? Right? If envy is the problem, what advice do what should I be telling them to do? Because I don't want to say to them, oh, you've got to control the cultural discourse. You've got to go out there and put controls on Twitter, on Instagram. That's not the right solution. But it might be one that some policymakers say, okay, you've told me that that's the problem. That's going to be my solution. And that will not be a good outcome either. I think this is something that's hugely important and quite nuanced that we need to think about. But thank you for your intervention. Really, really important and thoughtful. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Maria, if that's okay.
Thank you. Like, really great lecture. I'd like to make 2 points. I agree that inequality is no sufficient statistic, but when you were talking in your lecture, I thought like many of the problems that you exposed to us are actually problems of inequality of opportunities. That is a type of inequality. And I would like to tell some impression that I had about the last graphs that you showed us is actually I'm worried if it's just a correlation and not exactly a causation, because what we saw in many countries is that like globalization and economic growth, actually the rich could appropriate more of the benefits of globalization, for example. But at the same time, we saw that, like, for example, education rose in many countries, and like the education premium reduced, and like this actually benefited the poor. And we also saw like a rise in, like, for example, cash transfer programs. And actually this was important to reduce inequality in some countries. So first is actually, I was worried it was not actually a causality, but it was a correlation. Like the second point I would make was about like the first graph that you showed about demonstrations. So what actually explains the rise in demonstrations? Because yeah, what we saw, it was like we actually got better in many ways. Like we got better in terms of education, we got better in terms of like economic growth in some countries, but at the same time, these countries that actually experienced economic growth are the countries that are having demonstrations right now. One example was Chile, and another example was Brazil in 2013. And why are these countries having like massive demonstrations and strikes? And maybe it's because like it is not enough what we get so far. Like we progress, but we want more. And maybe inequality is one of the explanations. Like we progress, like in terms of like income, but it's not like it's not everybody that actually benefited from this economic growth. And there are other types of inequality that actually move protests. For example, racial inequality, and we see Black Lives Matter, for example, in the US, or for example, the feminist movement in Latin America, there is also move, because like we women do have not the same rights as men, or not the same economic opportunities. So my actually point is that like there are like a lot of types of inequality. They are not actually income inequality, and those types of inequality matter. For example, inequality of opportunities, or gender inequality, or racial inequality.
Thank you, Maria. That's an excellent points. I'm really glad we're having this conversation. May I respond to your items in turn? First is inequality of opportunity rather than just inequality. Spot on. This is exactly what gives people hope. It is exact. So in a way, I mean, there used to be this story. Oh, in America, don't worry about high inequality because everybody knows they've got a shot at making it. Right? They've always got it's a level playing field. They'll be able to get ahead. What we should really be concerned about is equality of opportunity, not inequality of outcomes. I'm completely for that. If that's the case, we should stop obsessing about our measurements of inequality. No one has ever provided a graph of inequality and opportunity. All the graphs that we've seen everywhere, that everyone is so worried about, are all graphs, tabulations, calculations of inequality of outcomes. We are not shy about looking at those graphs and inequality of outcomes, and when they confirm our prejudice that says there's inequality of opportunity, about latching onto them and saying that's the problem. I'm completely with you. We should be looking at the real problem. The real problem is inequality of opportunity. Let's do that. But then let's not pretend that by looking at graphs of income inequality, we understand the problem better. We don't. Looking at mobility, looking at where people in the income distribution are actually rising, looking at actually what's happening to the average income of the bottom 50%, I think gets us closer. It's still not perfect, but it's better than looking at inequality, income inequality, better than just looking at income inequality. I'm agreeing with you. Let's stop paying homage to all of these people who are producing graphs of income inequality, because that's not the only reason we're paying homage to them, to their work, is because they confirm our prejudices. As social scientists, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be looking at the equality or inequality of opportunity. I completely agree with you. The counterintuitive fact that you mentioned, that in some societies, as income growth picks up, we see more and more demonstrations. That is a puzzle from the perspective of traditional models of political economy. Let me give you another example. In France, the Yellow Jackets demonstration. The Yellow Jackets demonstration picked up precisely when the French government started giving wage concessions to people in that sector. It was precisely when their economic well-being was being improved that they took to the streets. It's really important to understand why this happens. But it also says, if we don't understand it right, we're going to be facing diminishing returns in the policies that we make. Then finally, if I may, correlation and causality. I used to work in time series econometrics, and we had a whole language about how we talked about causality that's different from the ones that we now use in RCTs and panel data analysis elsewhere. But the underlying issues are the same. And the issues there were, if someone had discovered a strong correlation and they started describing it as causality, you needed to challenge that. And by challenging that with a structural model, you could overturn their finding. Here, I'm not suggesting that I've got a strong evidence, I've got a strong correlation. In fact, I've got the opposite. I've got no correlation. I've got zero correlation between inequality and indicators that I'm interested in. The correlation that I did detect positively was always described in terms of, well, every time you see this, you also see this. And that is not going to be overturned. Every time you see an improvement in people's well-being at the bottom 50%, 96% of the time, you also see an increase in inequality there. And that's something that's not causal, but it's something that challenges our understanding of what the relation ought to be. It says that the zero-sum view of the world is just flat wrong. something else is going on. So thank you very much for your questions. I haven't been able to treat every detail, but for everyone, if I don't get to your questions, please feel free to email me. I will come back to you. This is really interesting and exciting for me. Now, Kavita, please.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I actually did have a very similar point to what the person before me had mentioned, which is to consider socioeconomic, other sociocultural systems which may be systemic. But because that point has already been mentioned, I'm just going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate with that same point, which is that some of the inequality that is propagated, say, through things like gender, race in India, caste, are, like also things that at below certain income levels are also characterized by a lack of resources. Even though there is the opportunity side of it, like for example, people might be denied drinking from the same water commons as like other castes of people. So I do believe that like certain aspects of that problem are either have been considered by this hypothesis in that sense. But as mentioned, there is a need to make it more wider, and because this is a complex problem to understand. I just had one more point to mention, which is that it's more of a question, which is I'm trying to take your hypothesis and apply to a much smaller scale. I'm just trying to understand it at a much smaller scale than, say, comparing countries. So what I'm trying to understand is that there is this concept that is prevalent in poverty of intergenerational inequality or intergenerational poverty, which is that, and to me, when I'm thinking about it, my immediate question is to ask, are these the same people that are going above and below the line and above and below, say, the poverty line over time? And hence, let's say, hence say like inequality stays at a certain level, or as against that, are more people coming under inequality, and vice versa, when you have a policy to reduce inequality, would that also be an important thing to consider?
Yeah, thank you, Kavita. On your first point, like you say, that's a very valuable discussion. You're being devil's advocate, and we can talk back and forth on that. Maybe we'll do that offline. On your second point, the quick answer is that it depends. In societies that are stagnant, then there's a lot of moving back and forth across the poverty line. In a society like China or Estonia or elsewhere or Singapore, when you've got this massive uplift of the bottom 50%, they are off and running into the middle income class. Someone asked earlier, these are just the relative bottom, the relative weak and disadvantaged, and that's absolutely right. The bottom 50% in Singapore would not be considered poor in a different part of the world. But we're still concerned about them. So the answer to the question is it depends. Thank you very much for your intervention. Thank you. Guillermo.
Sure. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering about your graphs, whether that correlation would hold if you take into account population weights. And the second thing will be if you consider another measure of the poor. Let's say you're considering right now the 50% bottom, but what about like the 10% bottom or the 20% bottom or the 30% bottom? Otherwise, it will be just, I don't know, like.
Okay. Let me quickly speak to this. On your first point, I'd be keen to know what you mean by taking into account population weight, because one way to do that is to say, let me not compare countries, let me not compare economies, but let me compare individuals. So let me do like a Branko Milanovic, say, looking at poverty and income across people, lining them all up. And one could do that, and then you end up with basically a graph of the income distribution across people in the world. If you don't have independent units, there's no there's no sample to speak of. So but then you might say, well, let me take the bottom 50% of the entire world and compare that to the top 10% of the entire world, and how is that evolving over time? Because you can do that in a time series way, but then you don't do the cross-country comparison. I agree with you, that would be interesting things to do, But also for the chart that I've got here, remember, China is a stonking 1.5 billion people. So if we weight that chart by what happens, by how much population a country has, China basically dominates that picture. And China's story is, you want poverty reduction, you want lifting the poor, pay the price in inequality. That would be what we would get when we weight this by people. Now, your second question was equally interesting, but could you say a key word? My mind's just lost a bit on that. Repeat your second question. It was really interesting.
So whether the same correlations that you find for the bottom 50%, would hold for other thresholds?
Got it. Got it. Okay, I would love to do that, Guillermo. I would love to be able to drill down further. I am constrained by data that are already collected for the income distribution across, within countries. Remember, 10 years ago, we didn't even have the top 10% and the bottom 50%. Now we do. But that's thanks to a lot of diligent hard work by Thomas Piketty and his people. They don't have, as far as I can tell, the bottom 40%, bottom 30%. It's a huge amount of work that they have already put in, from tax records and all of that. I already give them huge credit. I admire them hugely for having done the bottom 50%. At some point in the future, if we do a bottom 40%, I'm happy to go in there and leverage their goodwill and redo all of these. But right now, that data is not available. Thank you.
Thanks.
Maria, another Maria. We've got a lot of Marias here. You're the third Maria now. Maria Montoya.
So yeah, I was wondering, this increase at the bottom 50%, you have to zoom in to see this increase, right? Like, you don't see it from the first graph. And I wonder, well, yes, people are better off than before. People at the bottom are, but is that enough to have a better life, to have an improvement in well-being? So we're seeing that. That's why I was asking about the poverty lines, because well, maybe even if you have like income at a constant level, that doesn't really reflect purchasing power. And also, like, life has changed a lot in the last 30-40 years. So I wonder, okay, maybe the incomes of these people at the bottom 50% have increased, but really at what cost? In the term of people now have to commute 2 hours to come to work. People are not able to own a house anymore, even if they're middle class. I don't know, these types of things, and other subjective indicators that may be relevant.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. Those are excellent questions. And at some point in the future, if we are, because this also gets to the heart of a debate about whether GDP is a good measure of the economic performance of a nation. What you're describing for people is reflected also in a large debate about whether gross domestic product is the right measure. Joe Stiglitz and many other people have been involved in this. I am very happy to consider the possibility that all of these are just off. What I've used here, I've done this for different variants. I've done this at market exchange rates. I've done this at inflation adjusted. I've done this at purchasing power parity. The stories are all pretty much the same. The magnitudes might change a bit, but the stories are the same. Now, having said all that, however, you are still right. You could still say, yeah, but that doesn't reflect, the price of congestion. That doesn't reflect the externality that the environment is degraded. That doesn't reflect how much harder people have to work now. And I'm completely with you on all of those things. If we're able to construct national income statistics that take all this into account, I'm all for digging into that and using that. The Human Development Report recognized these difficulties for 50 years ago. And what they did with that was that they said, okay, take GDP, but let me correct it for income inequality. So they did a very gross adjustment. The point is that doing what you want to do is hugely important. We're nowhere near to doing that. And we don't have the resources at this point to fix that.
Sorry to jump in, but what I'm saying is, like, because I'm not convinced that inequality is not as important, because I think what is really reflecting from this,
the reason that you say inequality matters is because we've got income inequality statistics. But those income inequality statistics are just as flawed as the things that I'm doing that you are critical.
No, I'm saying like from your graphs, what I take from your graphs is that the story that the graphs are saying is like, oh, we're growing, the economy is growing, and it's clear that it's growing better for some people. And we are not really sure that these people that are slightly getting better are really doing better in like, okay, concerning all things together, right? So that's why I'm not too convinced that that's not
you're right. You're right, Maria, you're right. And but my what I want to come back on is if I can see a way ahead where I can actually do research that would shed light on this, I would do that. I don't see a way ahead. I don't see how I can do that for 200 countries, taking all of this into account. Moreover, I would say that all the statistics that we are now using to reflect that life might not be so good in some countries are actually the same statistics that I'm using to show that life is not necessarily so bad. If you accept those statistics, then I suggest that you should also accept mine. Having said that, I agree that your criticism is, I agree with your criticism. And if we could see a way forwards to correcting these statistics, to take this into account, I would do that. I would welcome the energy of other researchers who want to do that, to go ahead and do that as well. Thank you.